As we begin, a couple quick things. I'm going to drop a document in the chat because I have a lot of energy about this topic, and this presentation slash workshop has a lot of references that I want to make sure people got. So the PDF is going into the chat right now. You do not need to reference it right now, but in the future, if you're sitting there being like, what was Sean talking about? Or what was that game that Sean mentioned? This would be a great document. I'd also invite you to have some kind of note-taking device, whether that's just notes on your phone or a piece of scrap paper and a pen. If you don't have that, it won't get in the way at all, but it's always nice to have that in case we come up with any good ideas. And we're going to begin by introducing a quote that I hope kind of guides our workshop today. And I'm going to use a lot of quotes throughout this. And when I do, I'd like to stop talking for a minute because I'm going to be talking a fair amount in the beginning. So I'm going to invite anyone to go ahead and unmute themselves whenever a quote shows up and just read it aloud to the group. The opening quote that I think is going to be a good guide for the next hour comes from Adrienne Marie Brown's Emergent Strategy. Could I ask someone to...
We are in an imagination battle. I often feel trapped inside someone else's imagination, and I must engage my own imagination in order to break free.
Thank you so much. So this idea of imagination capture and breaking free and recognizing the limits of our own imagination is something that really drives my creative work, and I hope is something we can explore in today's workshop. So we're going to start by saying hi and tooting my own horn a bit by introducing myself. My name is Sean. I use they, them, and he, him pronouns. I work for Narrative 4 as an advisor, a trainer, and a program developer. Outside of that work, I have a long career in education as a school teacher and principal, but now I do a lot of work in community and cultural organizing, visual arts, and tabletop game design. So I'm going to start just by giving you a bit of context into my own work by sharing a couple games that I have created and published. If you happen to know me at all, you probably know me from a game called Long Haul 1983. It's a single player game of isolation, precarity, and interrogation of like what our personal commitments are during a catastrophe. The game works where basically you play a truck driver in a long distance journey, and every day on the road, your character makes a phone call and leaves a message to a very important person they're trying to reach. And the way the game works is you tell the story through the answering machine messages you play as you record. So when you finish the game, you have an audio artifact of the entire story. It was really neat last year that a writer from Tabletop Magazine named it as one of the 100 best games of all time. It's taught in high school and college level creative writing programs. And there are a lot of really cool podcast adaptations that kind of dig into these themes in different ways. A very different kind of game that I wrote is a party game called Tattoo, which thinks about the ideas of creative labor and the commodification of art. In Tattoo, you play two roles, both a hot, scuzzy, talented tattoo artist on a reality TV show, as well as their unhelpful and abrasive clients. I do all the graphic design, publishing, writing, and kind of development myself. This is a one-person project for me. I wrote a series of games called Chess, which satirize toxic competition and think about the gatekeeping of culture and play and the way we see games portrayed in pop cinema. In fake chess, two players sit down at an actual chessboard and pretend to be good at chess. It's actually become a game that has international competitions all over the world, which is ridiculous and hilarious. My newest game that's coming out soon is called Magnetic Resonance, which thinks about the for-profit medical industry, ideas of capital and carcerality. It tells the story of a science fiction-y prison break, and it's designed to be played while you, the player, get an MRI. So those are some of my games. And we're going to talk a lot more about other people's games throughout the rest of the workshop. First, I wanted to talk about the objectives for the workshop, though objectives feel a little too formal and put a little too much of the work on you. So instead, I'm framing this as my hopes. Today, my hope for you is that by the end of this hour, you're going to see storytelling games as an essential and exciting form of contemporary art, that you'll see them as an opportunity to break free from this imagination capture, that you can see them as a support for creative writing and creativity in general, and think of them as a tool for community activation and real-world social impact. And so to begin, I want to make sure we're all on the same page. So we're going to take a minute just to think about some community care agreements. 3 very basic ones for today. I'll read them aloud and explain them, see if we have any questions, and then make sure we all agree. So the first is take care of yourself. Please, if you need a break, take a break. If you need food to drink, please eat, drink. At certain times, we are going to be on mic, engaging in small conversation with a couple other people. Sometimes that has a lot of mental load. Please feel free to ask for help. The second is that we're going to take care of each other. That means that we're going to be able to make sure that we're really prioritizing the validation of each other's ideas and recognizing each other's vulnerabilities. And finally, we're going to take care of our stories. We want to be as engaged and as present as possible. We want to make sure that we're sharing the spotlight and always ready to jump in. And we're going to embrace kind of like the peculiar weirdness that comes with these role-playing and storytelling games. So if you could give a signal that you're on board and agree, either by putting a thumb up to your screen or giving an emoji or a signal, I will try to scan through the best I can and make sure that I see everyone's buy-in before we go any further. Thanks so much. All right. So what are we talking about today? Well, before I go any further, I'm going to be using 2 terms that are pretty much interchangeable, role-playing games and storytelling games. I prefer storytelling games because we're not always playing a particular role or character in these kinds of games. But when you see me go back and forth, that's because we're going to treat them as pretty interchangeable. If you don't know what a role-playing game is, this is the way I normally explain it to folks who come play for the first time. Playing a role-playing game is basically a conversation. We're sitting around a table, we're talking, we're taking turns, we're adding ideas, we're asking each other's questions, and we're moving the story or the conversation forward. The players get to be both author and audience, which means that we get a lot of agency over thinking about the kinds of stories we want to tell and explore, but also we still get to be surprised. Oftentimes, games will use devices for chance and obstructions, dice, coin tosses, playing card draws, the rules themselves, to create a story that no one could be planning and expecting and telling alone. And finally, role-playing games are driven by interesting choices and a sense of curiosity. There's no traditional winner or loser to this kind of game. We are just here to tell a good story. So if we are creating a story that we are excited to tell, we're all winners. When you imagine what it looks like, you think about people sitting around a table, hopefully having a good time, with lots of paper and pens and dice and writing equipment, sometimes beverages, sometimes snacks, sometimes very serious looks on their face as they debate about what comes next. If there's any role-playing game that you've probably heard of and seen, it's probably Dungeons and Dragons. And I promised at the top of the hour that I would be doing a little disparaging of this game because we're going to say no to Dungeons and Dragons today, for a couple reasons. The first is that it has a really high, heavy complexity. It takes a long time to learn. The rule books are hundreds of pages. It can take hours just to get started telling a story. It's also expensive. These books aren't cheap, and the corporation that runs it loves to kind of find ways of pulling more and more dozens of dollars from people. It's also got some tough stuff in its DNA around settler colonialism, imperialism, eugenics, and things like that. Contemporary players do a really good job of working around that, but I'm more interested in games that are built from the foundation with something else. And finally, Dungeons & Dragons is really corporate, and we're too cool for that. We want indie outsider art. So today we're going to focus on thinking about things that are easy to approach and engage with, that are economically accessible, that are rooted in liberatory imagining, and that come from really singular creative voices. So over the next couple minutes, I'm going to run through some of my favorite games that I would recommend to anyone before we dive in and actually start playing some stuff. As I said before, we have no need to quickly jot down everything. There's a references page that I put together that has all the stuff I'm about to talk about. So if anything piques your interest, feel free to reference that page. What I want to do now is give you a sample of what this art scene really looks like today. So if you were kind of like a D&D player and want to play an action fantasy game, I might recommend Our Farm Becomes the Battlefield, in which you tell the story of a collective of displaced farmers piloting farm equipment retrofitted for battle to take back your land from a wizard who has gained a monopoly on food production and forced you into sharecropping. If you want an underdog story, I might recommend Misspent Youth, a game about teenagers rebelling against a corrupt and dictatorial authority. One thing I love about this is there are no health points, no deaths. Instead, your injuries as a character when you fight basically forces you to sell out your youthful convictions, moving from smart to pedantic, optimistic to cynical, thrill-seeking to nihilistic, until your character eventually becomes an adult and has to leave the game. If you want a story much quieter than that, with no characters at all, I would say The Ground itself. It considers how places change and remember themselves. And over a few hours of gameplay, you and a couple other people tell the story of one specific place over radically disparate time periods that range from 4 days to 18,000 years. Dialect tells the story of an isolated community through the way the isolation's language expands and shrivels. As a player, the way you play this is by literally creating new words that get incorporated into the culture of the community and seeing how those new vocabulary and new languages actually shape the identity of the community itself. Isolated communities are pretty popular in role-playing games. Dream Askew is a game that has no dice, it has no facilitator. It tells the story of a queer community holding itself together after the larger collapse of civilization. And its sister game, Dream Apart, tells the story of a Jewish shtetl in the Eastern European countryside as the Industrial Revolution begins. They use the same rules and mechanics, but have very different settings. If that piqued your interest, there's lots of history. The Price of Coal is a card game that explores the history of labor rights in West Virginia, specifically the Battle of Blair Mountain. Red Carnations on a Black Grave invites you to live the last 72 days of the Paris Commune. And if you're looking to say, well, that's a lot, I'd like something a little smaller and simpler, I might recommend Twain. It's quiet, it's personal. You play it in real life as yourself. And basically, as you go out into your actual world, you play this game as a layer on top of your real life, exploring the relationship with a fictional twin who you lost connections with and grew up to do all the magical things that you never got around to do. If that kind of personal storytelling intrigues you, Logan is an autobiographical game. You play as the author, Logan, and play through the experiences of the author's life, taking you through different situations in the life of a young trans man as he struggles with school and identity and visibility. There are lots of other ways of thinking about this. The Quiet Year is a map drawing game. You tell the story of one final year in a close-knit community by building an ever-changing and expanding map that records the events of the year. Amending, which is a game I'm playing right now, is a meditative sewing game. As you slowly plot the journey of your character, you actually literally stitch their path onto the map and end up with this artifact that becomes this literal piece of storytelling fabric. There's lots to talk about, and I'm happy to stay off a little later and give you more recommendations. But for the art and history and education nerds, I also want to kind of quickly give a speed round of some cultural and historical and artistic references at play. When we think about storytelling games, we can think about the spect actors of Augusta Boal's Theater of the Oppressed, people who are playing both audience and directly interacting and shaping performance. We think of Del Close and improvised theater games. We think of the Dadaist use of chants in political performance. We think of the Fluxus movement, whose founders described it as a fusion of Spike Jones, gags, games, vaudeville, cage, and Duchamp. When I think of Yoko Ono's work, and in the book Grapefruit, inviting us to do things like send 100 pieces of glass to someone who has broken our heart. That, in a way, is a game. We think of the Situationists, and the value that they placed in decentralizing creation with artists working in collaboration, plus their love of maps and cartography. We think of military wargaming and its history of like thinking about what things on a board can represent in real life. We think of tarot and other divination traditions. We think of DIY and punk movements, especially because so many of these games are coming from independent artists and publishers releasing them straight throughout the world without any kind of gatekeeping publication, press, or industry. And we think of the collective imaginative practices of abolition and justice movements. So, with that said, let's play a little. We're going to do a very quick warm-up before we get to the big stuff. Just a little bit of sense of how these games can challenge your creativity, but also spark your creativity. And at the risk of being self-centered, we're going to use one of my games. As I said before, Tattoo is a game that every round you have to make a annoying, unhelpful client to an artist whose grip on their own celebrity is pretty precarious. And to do that, every round, you just roll 3 dice, pick from a table, and then flesh something out. So since you probably don't have 3 dice in front of you, I'm going to go ahead and drop a link to just Google in the chat. When you click this link, 3 dice will hopefully roll on your screen. And you are going to pick those 3 dice results to mix and match from the 3 columns here to build some fundamentals to a character that might show up on a reality TV show that you can then expand and let your imagination run wild with any kind of details and backstory and personality and costume you want. And we're going to do this in 60 seconds. After that 60 seconds are done, we're going to go into breakout rooms where you and another participant are going to get to share what character you made in just 1 minute. Your goal here is to make it as strange and as idiosyncratic and as rich and robust as you possibly can. So I'm going to set my timer for 1 minute. You are going to have 1 minute to roll your dice, if you haven't already, pick from the 3 lists, and create a character that nobody besides you could ever think of. Then we're going to have a chance to share. Your 60 seconds begins right now. All right. So hopefully you have something. Again, this is a heavy load, so it is totally okay if you blanked or if you only got halfway there. Summer's going to throw everyone into a breakout room where you'll be paired up with 1 or maybe 2 other people and have just 2 minutes to go around and share what you came up with. Hello and welcome back. We have a countdown timer, but for those of you who have arrived, anyone want to share in like a sentence or 2, either something they heard their partner say that was like, whoa, I could never have expected that, or something that you came up with yourself?
I would like to share. I had fun. Thank you. I
You're
created a firefly with a flashing butt, musician, menopausal firefly. It was great.
That's incredible. Anyone else?
I'll share. I named myself Blue. I'm a fashion vlogger who got canceled for wearing $15,000 shoes made from trash.
Thanks so much, Alice. Also, very nice to see you. And a few other Narrative 4 folks. Hi, Carla. Hi, Lillian. Let's see. Hi, Abigail. I'm trying to scan through the room. Folks who are just coming back, we're just kind of, if you heard like something great, you can share in a sentence. Feel free to go on the mic and let us know what emerged.
I can share. I was the world's most successful hand model. but due to some injury, I'm no longer able to perform in my profession, and I'm sad and worried about what's next for my life.
Thanks so much. I got to be Jeffrey's partner, and there's a lot more backstory involving injuries in Minnesota and a hotel bar when they're 17 and all this other stuff. Really interesting backstory. So I think everyone is back from the breakout rooms. Welcome back, everybody. So that's a really quick taste of what you might do in the first seconds of a game. And I did that because I wanted to kind of not only hear what people came up with and eavesdrop on some conversations, but also give you an idea of how this can be a really good tool for inexperienced creative writers or people with kind of blocks around their own imagination. Giving us a few simple prompts can do wonders for kind of getting people moving in an unexpected direction. And I'm hoping that some of you may have even surprised yourself with the creative choices you made as you thought of your character. So now let's get on to the meat of this. In the second half of this workshop, I really want to talk about games as community activators. And to start, I want to share a pair of quotes. One from Ashley Bird, who is a Western Abenaki Indigenous scholar and game designer. The other from social historian and American scholar, Lerone Bennett. Can I ask someone to read both of these on the mic?
Even when games are not educational, they still teach us. An educator in a system of oppression is either a revolutionary or an oppressor.
So when we interact with games and play, we're always learning. And there are always lessons floating in the air. We have a lot of games that fall, I would argue, on the side of the oppressor in terms of their subject matter, their political positioning. If role-playing games let us imagine and plan, how do we keep players from imagining systems that don't run up against these basic ideas of oppression? Like, how can we have imagination around ideas like climate nihilism or state imperialism, militarism, economies of extraction and exploitation, settler colonialism? I think there's real power in these kinds of games based on the collaborative and collective imagining, which is why the Arts and Politics Collective that I run regularly hosts game days, where we gather folks from the community, often folks with no role-playing or storytelling game experience at all, to gather for an afternoon in some kind of small DIY community space and play. We gather them and have them come together so that we can have a small place where we can imagine new worlds whose stories directly interrogate those ideas from narratives that we get pummeled with so often, right? And when the collective is introducing games, we often give our objective something like this. We are here to enjoy gameplay as a site of political education and pleasure. We are here to expand our collective imaginations and political will, and we are here to explore definitions of revolution and radicality. We are not here to offer definitions. We're here to play and find out what ideas emerge. And so I'd like to take a moment before we dive back into gameplay with a new example to think about 3 quotes that, again, we use all the time when we're facilitating that I think are really valuable. The first one comes again from Adrienne Brown and Emergent Strategy. The second comes from Laura Shihai, the author of Psychoanalysis Under Occupation. And the third comes from Critical Resistance, a grassroots abolitionist group centered in Oakland, California. If someone could read the first one, please, by unmuting.
Science fiction is simply a way to practice the future together. It is our right and responsibility to create a new world.
Resistance, yes, means the fighter, but also everybody who is involved in the fantasizing and enacting of the new world that the resistance is about.
Oops. An abolitionist vision means that we must build models today that can represent how we want to live in the future.
So, when we think about games as spaces of imagination and practice, and not just creative writing, but also creation, these ideas speak a lot to me. I would love to hear from a few of you. This would be a great minute if you want to quietly reflect or type in the chat or get on the mic and share any kind of thought that came of mind when you were thinking about these quotes in the context of what we're talking about today in terms of collaborative storytelling.
Sean, can I say something?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I'm working in education for sustainable development, and this reminded me of I call it role play, but I don't know, you're giving me more breadth with this. There's a dynamic, let's say the ritual called the Council of All Beings, and I used it to reimagine the ending of the Giving Tree book, and it was really, really powerful in training, but I don't know how to expand it, but I didn't realize it was kind of related to what you're saying here, imagining the future and giving back to the book to make it a real giving and ecologically balanced situation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Wendy. There are tons of intersections with other practices here that before you get exposed to these games would never occur, but once you see kind of how they're built and what they're getting at, they're like, oh, here's a tool, right? In the chat, we have people talking about theater and ensemble building, the connections between this kind of work and practices around anti-racism and anti-colonialism, thinking about dreaming before we become, Jeffrey, creative visioning for the future as necessary as breaking down oppressive systems in the present. I'd encourage you to take a look at those chat notes as we move on to our next round of play. Oh, and real quick, somebody asked about the educator oppressor quote. That was Lerone Bennett. And I'll make sure that all the slides and stuff get shared too. So what might this look like when we're sitting down at a table and actually playing something? Well, we're going to return to a game I introduced earlier, Dream Askew, the game that tells the story of a caring community in conflict, right? Founded in love and solidarity, amidst ideas of marginalization, oppression, and collapse. Avery Alder, the developer of this game, is a really thoughtful designer because they incorporate ideas of ritual directly into the game itself. You cannot play this without rituals at the table. On top of that, it is a game that explicitly references emergent strategy. And there are entire phases of this game that are literally called idle dreaming because you are forced as a player to sit and ask questions and imagine what might be happening in a community like this. So we're going to break into groups and actually do the start of this game. We're not going to build characters this time. Instead, we're going to build a world. And to do that, you have two pieces of paper that I will drop into the chat right now. The first is the overview. This is the ritual that begins every Dream Askew game. One player picks up the book, or in this case, opens the PDF, and reads the introduction aloud to the group. Once that is done, we do some idle dreaming and imagining what this enclave might look like. To do that, we just share some ideas. If we were sitting around a table, we'd probably have some scrap paper and maybe some poster board and Sharpies and Post-it notes. Virtually, we're just going to do this mainly through conversation, but if you have a cartographical urge in you to jot some sketches down, please do so. If you want to record yourself and think about how you might use this setting that we develop in a couple minutes for your own narrative, please do so. It involves two steps. First, you select 3 visuals from a list. These lists are carefully curated to be as evocative as possible. So please don't be like, well, I picked this, you picked this, we picked this, we've checked off 3, now we're done. the idea is to select one and then elaborate, right? Build out a setting that feels peculiar and interesting and strange and not entirely utopic. Then, after you've picked a few visuals, you would go on to pick 3 things that are in conflict. This would be the start of your story and the heart of the story that you would tell playing this game over several hours. So again, as players, you get to decide what kind of world you want to explore and interrogate and use for your own imagining. So again, whenever someone feels an inspiration, they might select one and then flesh it out in any way. Remember that play is a conversation. So the entire idea here is that we are interacting. We are going on tangents. We are fleshing things out. We are making things weird and compelling and ambiguous and confusing, maybe. We're dreaming. So hopefully you have the 2 documents in the chat and have been able to open those up. I will also make sure that my screen is shared so that you have access to these in the breakout room if you want to reference them. But before we head into groups and take about 10 minutes to play this out and see if we can build a unique and unexpected world, can I answer any clarifying questions? So when you get into your groups, pick someone to read the overview aloud, and then go onto those pick lists and start building something interesting. We'll see you back here in about 10 minutes. And welcome back, everybody. Double check to make sure that if you were talking, you're back to muted, just so we can get there. Obviously, an hour goes by real fast. And I would love to hear more about what happened in your room over the last 10 minutes and what kind of ideas emerged as you thought about the idea of community and abundance and scarcity and precarity and all those other big ideas. But to make sure that we have time to kind of let things think, we're going to take 2 minutes just to quietly reflect. At the top of the page, I have the quote that we began the hour with from Adrian Murray Brown, talking about the imagination battle. And I have 3 possible reflection questions that you can listen to or totally ignore if you have other ideas in your head. The first, I'd invite you to think about what imagination battles did you encounter and how did you try to break free? Second, when did you experience the comfort or discomfort of collaboration, which is an essential part of play? Not something to be avoided, but something to be embraced and considered. And finally, stepping way back, how can the act of creating together using tools like these games be a part of your movement work, which we could define as educational or political or artistic or anything else? I'm going to invite you to take 2 minutes to quietly reflect. Feel free to jot notes, write down ideas, do some drawings, or just sit. And then we'll invite a few people to share some ideas before we close out today. All right, if you are still putting down ideas, feel free to ignore me. Your ideas are more important. But just like we did last time, if you do have an idea that you would like to share or a question that you'd like to ask, feel free to use the chat or fill the room with your voice by getting on the mic. We have about 2 minutes just to hear any kind of final closing thoughts, reflections, new ideas or insights that may be floating around your head. In the chat, I'm noticing 2 comments that both are about like how quickly things develop, both in terms of like the mental imagining of this world that we're making, but also the connections between players themselves at the table. Right? That's one of the real powers here. It comes with a lot of work around safety and consent and collaboration, as all collaborative artwork does, but there's real power there, right? I see Kate talking about using the old improv rule of yes and, right? Kind of like honoring contributions and building from them, even if they somehow divert from what you were thinking. the idea of like giving just a pick list that suddenly becomes a lot less overwhelming to start, especially when you're staring at, you know, the metaphorical blank page. A lot of ideas of joy and freedom and comfort. It was great. I see a lot of furrowed brows as people read the chat, so I think that's a good thing. At this point, I am going to say thank you so much. I had such a good time planning this workshop and being in a room of people who are so eager and engaged to kind of think about these ideas. If you want to continue the conversation, I put my email in the chat. I'm also dropping the references page one more time that has links to every artistic and cultural reference I made in that speed run, every game that I mentioned in my big bank, and some other resources that I quickly mentioned in passing that might be helpful or interesting for you to dig into if you're curious.